Hey, welcome to this is our last week of the book study. How sad. Okay, if you are here live, even if you're watching the replay, comment, let us know right before the call. Y'all know every week I'm like, what are we going to say? And so Geraldine was like, favorite summer drink. So that's what we're going to do. Comment, let us know that you're here, say hi, and share your favorite summer drink. Why not? Like, Geraldine, what's your favorite summer drink?
So I'm in Texas, and so sweet tea is like the big thing. And I used to never be a tea drinker, but there's a tea place right down the street from us, and I go every single day, and I get a strawberry lemonade with peach sweet tea, and it's the best thing in my life.
I was gonna say that sounds super summery.
It's so good.
Sweet tea is like my coffee, so I just drink sweet tea nonstop. Tomorrow
Oh
we're
yeah.
having Micah's first birthday party, and so Abe's
hmm
like, "Let's go to Chick-fil-A and get 3 gallons of sweet tea for the party." So
You have to.
there's not even that many people coming. So, anyways, okay. Hi, Victoria. She said sweet tea or frosted lemonade. Ooh, that sounds
Ooh.
good. Sounds
The
very
ones from
good.
Chick-fil-A are so good.
Oh yes, just everything from Chick-fil-A is
All of it.
delicious. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. If this is your first call and you have no idea who I am Brittany Heggie. I am the math brain behind Mix and Math, and I am joined by it's always the wrong way. Geraldine. Geraldine has goodness. I've known you. We've never met in person, but I've known you for
No.
like 3 years now. Yeah,
A
I
long
think
time.
3 years. She was like a founding member of Mix and Math 360,
hmm
and we just became friends. And then she's done some things with Team Mix and Math, and she's brilliant and wonderful. And y'all are gonna love her tonight. But I'm gonna throw it over to you if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, I am Geraldine Curry. I am a teacher in West Texas. I just got my dream job. I'll be an instructional coach slash interventionist on my campus after teaching fifth grade math for the last, oh gosh, I can't even keep up anymore. I think 8 years. This is my 8th year. So yeah, I've only ever taught fifth grade math. It's my heart. I love fifth graders. I love math. It's the perfect combo. Um, and yeah, just love math. I've been like dabbling into all kinds of different stuff. I love creating stuff for my students, and I've really loved learning from Brittany over the last 3 years. It's completely changed the way that I teach math, which is really
You were
cool. So I love
sweet.
that I get to like learn from you and like work with you and chat with you. It just makes me happy.
Yes, you're sweet. She's also like super creative and has like the best designs and has the cutest kids. So she's wonderful. And you're obviously a math genius as well. So, okay, this was the last chapter. I thought it was like just a really good wrap up chapter. I feel like there were some
hmm
things in there that they said that just like made some things click and clarified some things. So I really enjoyed this chapter. So we've got a lot to talk about tonight, but as usual, we are going to start off with your aha moments or your takeaways. I keep wanting to say wins, but I mean takeaways. So, Andrea said this chapter, really the whole book, was a great reminder not to fall in the trap of using word problems as tools for practicing computation. And I thought that was fabulous. That was like definitely something, I don't know about you, but I underlined that in the book as well. I
Yeah.
feel like that is like a mindset shift for a lot of teachers because the word problems are typically at the end of the unit and it's there like to apply what they've learned with, with computation. And that's
Yeah.
the sole purpose of it. So
That was
I love.
something I dabbled into a lot more really this school year because, I had the COVID year and then the virtual year. But that was something I really was intentional about this year is always providing context. And it was tough in the beginning because I was like, oh my gosh, we have to decipher this and you have to figure out what's happening. And it was a heavy load, but like as I just kept powering through, it became so much easier. And then by the
Yeah,
end of the year, I was like, wow, this was really worth the effort.
it makes a huge difference,
hmm
like for sure. Okay, Megan said she actually quoted from page 174, when we are young, we don't solve problems so that we can find the answer. We solve problems that we learn to solve bigger and more important problems. And I absolutely love this. This was something that I underlined as well, because I think a lot of times we view word problems as like, yeah, like if you get the answer, like that's it. But when we think about like their journey as learners of math, like everything that we're doing is to prepare them for like the next thing or the next, big milestone of understanding or something like that. So I love
hmm
that quote. Okay. Vicky said, my aha comes on page 175 when it says, recognizing that calculation and computation skills are important for student success. We also realize that computation alone is not very effective for preparing students to make sense of word problems or to pose and solve real world problems. I love that quote as well because, yeah, it just gets at the heart of like, why are we doing this? Like, why are we teaching students math? Why are we
Yeah.
teaching them these computation skills, which are important, but like the pushback is always like, well, they have a calculator right on their phone. And it's like, we can't end math instruction at computation.
I actually wrote that entire thing down because I was like, wow, this is really important for us to kind of get away from, oh, let's just go practice these 40 problems of computation. But then you get the word problem, which is how a lot of our tests are going now, and they're having to decipher things. And you're like, well, you know how to you know how to do the math, but do you know what's happening? Do you know what they're saying? And so really getting the kids to like think through things. Oh my gosh, it's just been such a really cool experience watching kids shift the kids themselves shift from like, well, I can do the math. Okay, that's fine, but do you know what the problem's saying? And then getting them to really realize taking things out and putting things back in and really, plugging stuff. It makes a huge difference in how they and like their confidence in math anyways. It's so cool.
For sure. And I think this is like a shift that we need to help students realize as well, because,
Mhm.
depending on their experiences that they've had with math in the past, they may view math as just computation and answer getting. And it's
Yeah.
like, we need to help them understand that math is so much more than that.
Yes.
So yeah, I really love that quote. This next one, this is kind of like a long one. So I am going to read it to you, but I thought it was really, really good, which is why I included it. So Kate said, I loved the way this chapter summed up everything we've read. So many takeaways, but one line I really loved was failed models are expected, but replacement models are also expected. The whole sandbox analogy, taking time to play and explore, just makes such good sense. This book has almost been a great reminder that oftentimes less is more. Fewer problems, dig deeper. It also has reminded me to not just focus on the math I need to teach for my grade level standards, but focus on the fact that the strategies I teach now and the mindset I foster can also be used to set students up for success down the road. I just felt like that takeaway was like the perfect takeaway to end like the entire like book
So good. Way
study.
to go, Kate.
Yes, exactly. Like there were just so many like all of the aha moments that she shared were really, I think, in my opinion, some of the biggest things that the authors wanted people to take from the book.
Mhm.
So we're actually going to dive into a lot of the different components that she talked about today. So all right, so let's kind of like dive into the chapter. So this will be structured just like all the other calls have. All the other calls have been. So we're going to go kind of through the chapter in order and just kind of share like our thoughts and takeaways. We're definitely going to get to your questions and talk about like what this looks like, like actually applying what we've read, what we've talked about in the classroom this upcoming school year. So, okay, so starting on page 173, so we're in chapter 9. So this part was so interesting. So let me kind of give you a little bit of backstory about why I chose this book. So if you look at the very bottom of page 173, so the start of chapter 9, it talks about the understand, plan, solve, and check like approach. And so it's interesting. So one of the authors of this book, her name is Linda Gojak. I think that's how you say it. I could be mistaken, but I think at one point she was the president of NCTM, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. So I read a problem solving book by her early in my teaching career. And it was all about problem solving. And it was through the understand, plan, solve, check like model. And so when I saw her name on this book, I was like, oh, like I already respect her. I love her work. Like, let me dive into this. And so that's a model that I've always used. And, there's some modifications that you have to do with it. But, I've seen students be successful. But when I realized, though, what they said here, I think it was actually on page 174, where they talked about the sandbox being the space between the understanding and the planning. I was like, that's it. Like that is like the summation, the right word. Like that was like just like the light bulb moment for me that made sense as to like what I felt like I had to modify in my class, or why I felt like we spent so much time in that understand phase, it was because there is that section between those two things that is so important. And it is that play. And I think too, a lot of times, like we forget that, with the understand, plan, solve, check, have you used that one, or what do you use, or what have you used in the past?
That's what I started using, probably like 4 years ago. I was a bad teacher. Just
No,
kidding.
but I don't think you were a bad
But I
teacher.
wasn't utilizing the problem-solving process in a way that was most effective for the kids. So then once I think I learned it from you actually. There was like Anchor Charts or something. I started using that and I was like, wow, this makes so much more sense because I think it's that what I got from it was that checking piece was going back and talking to the kids like, does that make sense in the context with our problem? And so that was a really big shift for me early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like, yeah, I don't think that, I'm thinking forward, like what to do. Like, I don't think that four-step process is bad, but it's kind of like it's almost like the CRA model. We've talked about
Mhm.
like I've talked about the CRA model for forever. I love it, but I've always had to add like almost like caveats. It's like, okay, this is
Mhm.
great, but you need to make sure there's overlap. You need to make sure you're making those
Yes.
connections. You need to make sure you're introducing it with context. So it's not that like understand, plan, solve, check didn't work for my students, because it did, but I was having to do so much work in that understand phase because I didn't like, I guess maybe subconsciously realized, or maybe didn't realize, that there is that space where it's like there needs to be that time to play. But then also, I think that, and this is an area that I don't think I maybe communicated well with students, was that like sometimes the models, like, or the representations that you're using for math are not just to solve it. Sometimes those are really helpful just to help you make sense of the problem.
Oh my
And I
gosh.
was like,
Yes. Yes.
I wish I could like go back and like very clearly communicate that with students. Like you're not just using the manipulatives to help you solve it. You're not just using the pictures to help you solve it. You're using them. It's okay to use them in a way to help you make sense of the problem, even if you haven't made sense of the problem before you even start touching the
Mhm.
models, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I don't know if I
Well,
communicated that clearly or not.
and something that I really liked, in this first paragraph is that it says, "When we emerge from the sandbox, nothing tangible, like, we don't take anything tangible away from that." And I think that's the perfect example of, yes, you can use things that may, and it may not be the way that you solve the problem, but it's the way that gets you through it, and that's what's most important is the journey.
Yep, absolutely. And they talked about that. There was a really good line. I don't remember where it was. Oh, it was about like the train. And they said like a train doesn't like barrel straight through to the end of the track.
Mhm.
Sometimes it like meanders, I say that, and rests and sits idle to allow thoughts to work and theories to come. And
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, it's like all of that is so important for the problem solving process. It's so important for us to think, to equip students with like the understanding to solve bigger problems down the line.
Yeah.
So I think
And
this is, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I also just like the idea of letting the kids kind of sit with it for a little bit and not even like necessarily productive struggle, but just really sitting with it and kind of like going through it and making sense of it on their own rather than me, interjecting or somebody else interjecting. Like I want them to just like sit with it. And I like
Yeah.
that. I really like that.
Absolutely. And so I know already anybody who's watching right now is probably like, okay, but we like pacing and we don't have enough time and like all of
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
And it's one of those things when I mean, if y'all have been in the mixed math circle for any length of time, I talk about math manipulatives so much. And one of the biggest pushbacks is that we don't have enough time to use them. And, kind of like my response to that is it's like, give it like one concept, like take the time you need for one concept and
Mhm.
recognize that like when students truly understand something, it saves time on the back end. You're not having to
Mhm.
reteach. You're not having to find like, you get to that point where it's like, oh, students have forgotten all of this. Well, now we have to reteach it. Now we have to find like all these different approaches, or strategies to try and teach them and all of that.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing with this book and problem solving. It's like if we can do fewer problems and we can give students that opportunity to really make sense of the math and like come out of it with new ideas and to see those connections and the actions and the relationships, it's like that's going to help them down the line. Like, how many times do we have to have students redo problems because they've just plucked the numbers out, they've gone through this entire process to solve it, and it's wrong, and it's like, okay, well, let's go back and redo it. It's like, well, we may not hit that point as often if we're taking the time to do this now. So it's like, I think it's so easy to say like, oh, but this takes so much more time. And I think on the front end it does, but I do think it kind of saves time on the back end. So
Well, something that I learned over the last couple of years is kind of scaffolding in the beginning and it saves me a lot of that RTI process at the end. So if I'm putting in differentiation techniques and doing my scaffolding in a way that's most effective for the kids, that, I mean, whether it's using the manipulatives or breaking down the problem or anything like that, when I was doing that, it saved me, I mean, days of time, just because I wasn't having to go back and, assess this data and do all these different things for kids that were just like, what's happening? So if putting in that work in the beginning, like you said, it's a lot, but it pays off because you're not having to do it afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And that's going to be like my call to action here. Like, if you are really doubting that you have the time to do this, like, my encouragement to you would be, one, to like establish this foundation or this mindset early in the year. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But then try it with like one concept and just see what happens on the other side. Like, give it a little bit of time. Because I just think you'll see like the fruit of that on the other end. It's not, and with anything, it's like nothing's permanent. So it's like, you try something and it doesn't work for you, then like, fine, go back. I mean, I hope you don't. Like, I hope after, reading this book, you're motivated enough and inspired enough to try it and stick with it. But it's okay to try it for a little bit and be like, nope, I need to go back and modify or whatever. I don't know if y'all heard my computer dinging. I need to turn on do not disturb. Okay.
I don't know if you remember this, Brittany, but a couple of years ago, this was, I think, right after you opened up Mix and Math Academy. I had started, like you said, I picked one skill, and it was division. And my kids had come to me with very, very low division skills, just not a lot of experience, just all the things. And so it's like, okay, this is going to be the unit that I try this method, using the CRA model, like using manipulatives, all the things. So I really dove into with my division, and my district assessment scores were through the roof. Just like leaps and bounds. It just improved from where they were before. And I remember messaging you like, oh my gosh, it actually worked.
Well, it's so hard, especially when you feel like trapped by your pacing guide, especially in districts where you don't have that flexibility. It's so hard to have the confidence to like get started. But I love messages like that. Oh,
I cried
you just made
so
my
many
day.
days. I remember like just being so frustrated, and I'm like, I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing. Like, I just felt very, very low confidence with it. But I knew that if I just kept with it, it would be worth it. And oh my gosh, after those 3 weeks, and they performed so well. And then, I mean, even throughout the year, they improved and got even better. And I was just like, wow, okay, I'm sold now. Like, that's all I need to know.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. But then also, everybody who's watching, like, same thing. Like, give yourself some time, commit to it for a period of time. Like I said, we're going to continue to talk about like different ways to make that happen in your classroom. But I don't even know how we got on that tangent. Let's see. Okay, so going down the page, several people said that figure 9.1 was just really nice in like clarifying the sandbox. And I thought it did a really good job of like clearing some things up and like making it click. I'm like, oh, I kind of wish we had like this exact explanation earlier in the book. Because I really enjoyed what they said. And two, also, they were talking about, I underlined this in the interface. They said, understanding what is happening is the ticket into the sandbox. And I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. So that's kind of where I was going when I was talking about like that space between understanding and planning. It was like, oh, like once they understand what's happening in the problem, now there's that next step of like, okay, now we need to play with it. Now we need to figure out like just how we can represent this, like where's the math in this. So Facebook user said that they highlighted that portion as well. So I loved that. Was there anything that stood out to you, Geraldine, in figure 9.1 or like the little table that came after it?
The biggest part for me, which is what I struggled with so much, is justifying that last piece of it, because I feel like I got really good at like getting the kids to understand what was happening, identifying that math action, finding different, even having different entry points to the problem. I feel like I got really good with that. But then that justification phase where, yes, you got an answer, but does that work, or does it make sense, or is that where we needed to go with this, or where do I need to go back to? Because I mean, I did something correct, but where do I need to, and I may have done something a little bit wrong or whatever, but where do I need to go back to identify what went wrong in my process? And so I really, really love that they put it on there to be like, okay, make sure we're always justifying the solution.
Yep, absolutely. And I think too, like that is such an important skill for students to have. I know for me, like I think I've shared this so many times. I feel like at my Get Your Teach On presentation, I shared it, and then maybe in the last Facebook Live, but I'm so much of a perfectionist that like I'm constantly going back through like anything that I'm doing, like any work that I'm doing, or like if I'm, building something for the house or something like that. And I'm going back through and checking over my work and making sure that it makes sense. Like that's a skill that really every child needs to have. And so I think that's often looked over in the classroom. Like it's not just that we need to justify, to keep from having like wrong answers, but also that justification piece is helpful in being confident in your solution as well.
Yeah.
Like knowing that went through the right process, or that it just makes sense. And then, very superficial, like we're talking about end of grade tests, like if honestly, if a student can analyze like the what word am I looking for? Analyze the no, I'm not looking, not realistic. What do you do in check? It's like reasonable. If they can analyze whether a solution is reasonable or not, most of the time they can knock out like half of the answer choices because half of the answer choices aren't reasonable. So like on a very superficial level, like that's an important skill there as well. So
well, and it also makes me think about my friends who like to rush through because they're really good at computing, because they can identify those pieces really quickly. But then if I go back and say, okay, well, what's it asking? Like, what did it ask you? Or why did you do that? They're having such a hard time pinpointing what that is. And so making them go back to justify, oh my gosh, it's really cool watching them think through it, because then they're able to really, I guess, synthesize what's happening. I know, or like later in the book, I talked about the kids that are like racing through stuff and how to, prevent that. And I think this is a really good way to do that as well, is using that justification piece with fidelity.
yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like, sometimes I would have students like the entire purpose of the problem was to justify. And, it might, and it's not necessarily, and actually, I don't know if justify is the right word here, but I guess like assess whether answers are reasonable, and then they have to like justify, whether it is or not. But I think too, there's nothing wrong with having a problem, providing a solution, and students having to almost like go back and make sense of the problem and figure out like if that answer makes sense, like if it's reasonable, if it matches the context. So if you're in a position where your students are refusing to justify, like sometimes like that needs to be the goal of it, just to get them to do it more often or to get comfortable doing it.
Well, and for my Texas teachers, they have access to this. It's like a lead forward playlist that has like a bunch of strategies, and that's one of the strategies that you use with your kids, is justifying answers. So you can even give students like wrong answers, and they have to go back and justify like where this person went wrong. So that's there's so many ways to utilize that that last piece of the sandbox, which is really neat.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's kind of dive into some of the shifts for building students' problem solving skills. We're not just going to like go through and like read them or anything like that. We can just go through and highlight like if there was one that specifically stood out to us or any additional thoughts that we had. I know several people mentioned this in the comments. Oh, hold on. Sorry. just a sec. I wanted to address this question before we move on. So somebody said, do you suggest using error analysis as part of math? I personally love error analysis, both with computation and when we're talking about problem solving as well. I actually use error analysis a lot too, like with manipulatives, like modeling something incompletely. Why am I like second guessing every word that comes out of my mouth? My mom makes fun of me because of my vocabulary, but once again,
Math brain.
exactly. I was like, this is why I don't teach reading, but modeling something in an incomplete way and having students analyze that or talk about like, how could we correct that model? So I love error analysis. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
Oh my gosh, that's my favorite thing to do. There's times when that would be like a class starter, and I would have something, modeled wrong, or I would have a problem that was done wrong, and I would have kids like get in groups and try to figure out and justify what happened. And just hearing those little conversations, it's the best. It's the best.
Yeah.
I absolutely love doing error analysis. That was something I did like on a weekly basis in my classroom.
Yeah, it's a great way to like assess students' understanding in a different way, like from a different angle, if that makes sense.
Because I also think if they don't know necessarily how to like compute, they can look at the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so page 175, the first shift that the authors talked about was do word problems for sense making and not just for computation. And I know several people pointed that out, but I felt like this would not be a complete call if we did not point that out again. Like word problems are not just to practice computation. I 1000% agree with that. And I think the shift here, I don't know if they said this specifically, but if your textbook or your curriculum that you're using only has word problems at the end and it's there to assess computation or to get them to extend or apply like what they've learned, I would encourage you to take those word problems and move them to the very front. So it's the very first thing that they're doing. And that will be a great way for you to, and again, like, okay, if we're moving this to the front, like it's still technically the same curriculum. It's still the same length of time. You're just putting that experience on the front end of it. And now that you're more easily able to apply what you just read in the book and you didn't add anything else to your curriculum. So, yeah, I love that. I loved that shift. What was the next shift that really stood out to you? I'm sure like all 8 of them were wonderful, but was there one that
Oh my
you were
gosh.
like, oh my goodness, yes.
I love number 2, where it mentioned something about naming factors when you're multiplying, because it said, 30 times 2 is not the same thing as 2 times 30. And I was just like, that's so important, because I feel like a lot of times, and myself included, I tend to use those problems interchangeably to try to get them to make sense of it, but that's not how it works. Like I'd have to specifically identify what those factors are or whatever I'm using. And that was just such a light bulb for me, because I was like, wow, the meaning, you have to provide meaning and then you can have the calculation afterwards. So I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this one too as well because so they said treat context and computation separately. Yes, absolutely treat them separately. And I really truly believe that context needs to come first. And here's why. Like context provides so much meaning to the numbers. So when you are like, yes, treat them separately, but when you are working to build students' computational fluency, like that context is so critical. And I always go back to multiplying fractions because that is the thing that I feel like I talk to teachers about multiplying fractions and walk them through the progression. And like, if we're just looking at those numbers, multiplying fractions is like, I mean, imagine how confusing it is for students. Like, what does 1/3 times 1/4 mean? Like, I can't visualize that or whatever. But as soon as you provide context, as soon as they have that experience, and we're talking about 1/3 of 1/4, and we're connecting it to something in real life, like it just makes so much sense. So yes, we need to absolutely treat these as 2 separate things. But also I think the importance of like building computational fluency on that context or that understanding that's come from the context. Okay, of course, the next shift that I loved is going to be number 3, but create more and varied representations. The part that I specifically want to highlight with this right here is that very last part. So a lot of times we we talk about these things and how we can support students who like historically struggle in math. But then we get questions about like, what do I do for my students who get it right away or they're more advanced? And this very last line on the bottom of 176, it says multiple and connected representations add shading and nuance to students' understandings, which leads to greater mathematizing power. And that immediately, I literally wrote, like, think about our students who are more advanced here. How does encouraging them, like, I think sometimes we think that, like, having them create or use another model or use another representation is like a waste of time, or it's, I forget what word I'm trying to say here. But here they're saying that it actually deepens their understanding. And it made me think about like how sometimes we as teachers, like we can get the answer quickly. We can use the algorithm and find a solution, but learning through this book or learning and through other ways and having to actually learn how to model it and use these different representations, it deepens our understanding of the concept. And it's the same thing for those students as well. So I always say, like, I would rather you go deeper with a student than be like, oh, here's the problem. They solved it. Like, let's move on to the next grade level standards. It's like, oh, but we can always go deeper. And I think that the varied representations helps with that.
Yeah.
Okay, what was your next one? Which one did you? Are we just going to go in order and just go back and forth?
I know, because I just said all of them.
I know. Obviously, they're all important.
Yeah. Let me see.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump in with this next one real quick because we can't skip it. We can't skip the exploring all the work that operations can do, because this is something I'm so passionate about, especially talking about the two different types of division and the two different like ways that we see multiplication, especially in 5th grade. So exploring all of the ways or all of the work that operations can do. And I just loved, I think it was chapter 1 or maybe chapter 2, where it talked about like our intuitive model for certain operations and, just giving students experiences outside of that. So that's one that I'm like, if there's anything you take away from this, this book talked about like all the different problem types and all of that. Like the whole point of that is to be really intentional with the problems that you're using with students. So looking at the problems that you're going to use for the day, and it's like, oh, am I constantly leaning towards this one action or one representation for division, or am I giving students experience with, both?
Yeah. So, and that was something that I wrote down too, is just making sure I'm focusing on actions more often than saying like, okay, what are you supposed to do? And so instead of me saying, what are you supposed to do? What action can we take? And I think just kind of changing my language a little bit will help them process it a little bit differently and look at it with a new lens, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I don't know that I had anything like all of the other ones. Like I said, I promised we weren't just going to go through this entire chapter and say that, just retell what you've already read. So I guess in the next one, the add operations since routines to the school day, I'm going to point out that third point, that third bullet, and it talks about applying their understanding of operations to any quantity regardless of the class of number. This to me, I think, is so important. And this is why, again, I'm just going to like call out the fact that doing this work on the front end saves time on the back end.
Yeah.
Because if we are doing this work on the front end and we're building students' understanding of like the action or the relationship behind these operations, it is so incredibly helpful when we get to working with numbers that may be a little bit more intimidating, whether it's larger numbers or whether it's fractions or decimals. Like if you give a student who truly understands addition or subtraction has no problem really early on in your, like if you're, depending on how you're, you group your units, but if you have like a unit on adding, subtracting, I'm thinking really 4th or 5th grade. So if you have a unit about adding, subtracting fractions and mixed numbers or fractions greater than 1, if students have an understanding of addition and subtraction, they have no trouble adding and subtracting fractions greater than 1 using manipulatives, because they know what that action is. They know how to model that. They know based on their understanding with whole numbers, like how to take those actions. And so it's like that work that you did when you were working on addition with whole numbers is so helpful, so beneficial when we get to fractions and decimals. So,
Oh my gosh, yeah. And that
yeah, so
also
I
makes
really,
me think of place value in so many ways because even like I said, I teach fifth grade, and so oftentimes I get students in fifth grade and their fourth grade teachers are like, oh, they don't have any sense of place value. They don't have any sense of place value. And I'm like, well, that's something that can be like trickled in with every single thing we're doing. So that really like hit home for me is just that place value factor is so important whenever we're looking at applying these operations later on. Is if we don't have that sense of place value, it's hard to move past that.
yeah, for sure. That's like a major foundation there. I think we talked about place value a little, was it last week? I think so, because we were talking about like 10 times greater and things like that.
Yes.
So, okay, a couple other things. Just this is small, but I wanted to just point it out for anybody who may have like read over this. But the authors did write, they said we would never grade work done in the sandbox. And so that's just something to keep in mind. You know, I know some districts or some schools require like a certain number of grades a day. And I think when we start grading students' work in the sandbox, then it makes it feel like it kind of removes the element of play. It removes the element of like trying things and failing and so forth. So I just felt like it was important to kind of like point that out.
Yeah. And like I said in the beginning, you know, making mistakes there is a safe space for them. I think that's really important, and like fostering that is it's okay to make mistakes, but on the other side, you know, like one of those comments said expecting something rebuilt at the same time.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what it was. It was like failed models are expected, but replacement ideas are also expected.
Exactly.
So I don't remember when we were planning to get into this. I'm looking at my outline. I don't remember when we were planning to jump into this, but I did want to address this. So we had in Mix and Math 360. If you don't know what Mix and Math 360 is, it's our membership for fourth and fifth grade math teachers. Literally, I feel like a lot of the stuff we've read in the book are things that we've talked about in Mix and Math 360.
Sure.
But we had a planning session yesterday, and so we were planning out the first week of school, and we were talking about just like the behaviors or the math norms or the math habits that we want to establish with students, and how so much of that first week it really can and should be spent like undoing what students believe about math. Like the majority of students come in believing certain things, and one of those things is that like you have to get a right answer right away. And if you don't, that you're bad at math. And so I think that whole like failed models are expected, but replacement ideas are also expected. Like to me, that is like an idea that has to be ingrained like in that first week of school. It's like you are going to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. You're going to get things wrong sometimes, or maybe a lot of times. That's perfectly okay. It is expected, but it's also expected like in this classroom, mathematicians like us, this is what we do. We go back and we find another way, or we use a different representation. And I just feel like that is something that has to be established that first week, or those first couple weeks. So we're not going back later and it's like having to undo things that maybe we've unintentionally communicated to students, you know, that we're solving and we're going straight to right answers. Like highlight those wrong answers, highlight students who go back and they find a different way, because a lot of times those wrong answers actually help lead you to the correct answer or the correct pathway. So, I love this quote. We did a study on this like a couple years ago. But errors are expected, inspected, and respected. Absolutely. If you do not have that hanging in your classroom, that's a great one. If you're like, oh, I have some blank space, like, let me add a quote. This is a fabulous one.
Yeah, for sure.
Patricia said that idea was in shift 8. Loved it. Page 178. We may have skipped over it. Yeah, I'm not sure. So, okay, I actually want to get to some of your questions. I have a little bit more, and obviously we didn't go through page 180, 181, all of that, but I want to answer some of your questions, then we'll kind of come back to the rest of this. So this first one, this is this was a big question that a lot of people have had. So finding a way to incorporate all of this into my daily routine is a wonder for me. I feel like I could do a mini camp at the beginning of the year, love that, and revisit it, but I'm not sure how I can best incorporate all I've learned. Geraldine, do you want to, I know we talked about this before. Do you want to start with your response to this question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Okay, so this was the exact same kind of mindset I had when I was reading through this, because I was like, man, I really want to help implement this on my campus with my teachers, but it can be very overwhelming for a teacher who hasn't always taught this way or thought this way, or really truly hasn't even learned math this way. So it's a huge shift that's needed to be made. But I think like having those bite-sized pieces, and like I know on page, what was it, 180, on 181, taking one of those 8 models and like trying to incorporate that like one time, and I think if you're able to be effective that one time, you can add a little bit more and start taking a little bit more. But I really feel like having this like all or nothing approach to this is going to burn you out really quickly, rather than taking what you can do for right now, because you can only do the best you can in the moment. And so if you want to just feel good about one thing and that's what you use this year and you get really good at it, then I think that's more than what's best for your kids, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, we talk about like with our students, I talk a lot about like learning journeys. Like it's
Mhm.
not that students don't get something and all of a sudden they get it.
Yeah.
It's a gradual, like, it's like baby steps towards understanding. It's all of these experiences that lead to finally getting it. And I think teaching's a lot of times the same way. And I don't think we give ourselves permission to be that same way. It's like, oh, okay, we're going to go from like 0 to 100 like in 1 year. And that's not the case. I think if we were to incorporate like everything in this book and for our classrooms to look exactly like it looks in this book, like that is like that's like ambitious teaching. Like that is like a goal to get there, but that happens with like little steps along the way. And
Mhm.
so thinking about how to incorporate it in the classroom, it's like what few ideas can you take and incorporate, whether that's like the idea of like using fewer problems or doing maybe like one problem a day, or maybe it's not even that you go all in and you use a sandbox next year and like that's your thing. Like maybe it's just acknowledging that there is space between that understand and plan, and it's like, oh, I'm going to be really intentional to build that space in for my students. Maybe it is, like maybe your takeaway is, just the intentionality behind the like problem types that you use again next year. Like I just don't think it is, I don't want anybody to like leave from this and be like, we're just going to change everything. It's going to be all new. Like it's like, think about reasonably, like what feels good. What do you feel confident taking into next year? And it could be
Mhm.
pieces of this. Um, it doesn't have to be every single thing you learned. So because I also think when we do that too, we try everything, we get overwhelmed, we feel behind, whatever, and then we just scratch everything and go back. I kind of feel like that with working out too. It's like you either are like all in or you're all out. And it's like, no,
Mhm.
it's okay to do a 10-minute workout one day. Like,
Yeah.
yes, eventually I'd love to do a 60-minute workout, but like inch your way into this. So
Well, and there was a quote in here, and I can't find exactly what page it was on, but it said something along the lines of, "The sandbox is not a place to go, but a mindset to have." So it's not necessarily like,
yes.
"Okay, let's just go to the sandbox right now and we're gonna be in the sandbox." Like, no, it's just a mindset that we need to start having for ourselves, more importantly, and then showing the kids how to have that same mindset.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. So I'm going to respond to that in just a sec. I wanted to show Lisa's comment. She said, districts expect to see major changes in a program in 1 year before they give up. And so as teachers, we tend to adopt this same mindset. And I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because it there's so much that goes into this. It goes into like our comfortability of applying certain things, and obviously like the more you do it, the better you get at facilitating these types of discussions. um, so yeah, give yourself some grace. It's going to take time and you don't have to do it all right away. So Geraldine, your comment about the whole mindset, I really feel like that, to me, and I don't know if the authors intended it to be this way, but to me, I think a lot of what's in this book is more of for like the mindset shift of the teacher. Like when we're talking about like these problem types, like it's not that we want to like show students these exact problems and say like, hey, sort these and all of that. Like it's for our minds to be aware, oh, there are tons of problem types. Like let's be intentional with this. Or even the sandbox, like just like you said, like it's a mindset. Like, and it's good to view it that way because we're not going to have like a physical copy of a sandbox when students are in high school, like, solving it in that way. We want them to adopt that process, adopt that way of thinking. And so I really loved, I don't remember reading that quote. I just thought you made it up and you sounded like brilliant. So maybe it is actually in there. Okay. Let's see. There was another question. Somebody asked about math journals. Andrea was saying about responding to your students' work and asking them questions, especially if you only see them twice a week for a half hour in intervention block. We actually were having a discussion about math journals in the Mixing Math 360 Facebook group. So I did a Facebook Live really this time last year, probably not exactly this time because I was in the hospital giving birth last year. So probably a couple weeks before, I did a Facebook Live about math journals. And so if you want the link to that, I can't drop the link in the comments, but if you make a post in Upper Elementary Math Teacher Facebook group, or if I remember, I'll do it and ask for that link, I will get it to you. The other one was from Kate. And was this the same Kate that posted this wonderful? Oh, yes, it is the same Kate. Kate's on it this week.
Yeah,
Kate said, our math series has lessons geared towards specific problem-solving strategies, like working backwards, too much, not enough information, guess and check. How would you blend in and practice those types of specific strategies while also focusing on building operation sense? So do you teach the strategies in isolation or blend them in from the beginning or do little mini lessons as they come up, or both? So that was a great question. And my thoughts with this are, I think it's on page 181 and it's number 4 in figure 9.4. And it talks about how when we're looking at different models, it says explicitly model new forms of diagrams or manipulative, explain your decisions as you demonstrate how you're using the tool. And you're not, and basically like justify your thought process. And I actually think like that can be a really strategic way to expose students to new manipulatives, but also different approaches as well. Like I don't see anything wrong with like if your curriculum's saying like you need to intentionally teach that, well, okay, give students time to explore a problem in a sandbox and then maybe point out like, oh, I want to share how I solved this and justify your thinking, why you use that approach and all of that. And that's allowing them time to make sense of the math and explore first, but then you're exposing them to your approach and you can connect your approach to that of your student. So that was kind of my thought. What did you think, Geraldine?
I think a lot of times we can get into like the mindset of we have to like compartmentalize different components of the way we're exposing students to new strategies or anything that's out of the norm, the normal range of what we're comfortable with, that we feel like we have to kind of do those things explicitly, whenever I really feel like that can just be taught in conjunction with everything else, rather than, okay, here's one problem with this strategy in the sandbox, and then here's another problem with this strategy in the sandbox. I think it all can be taught cohesively, especially for those students who maybe aren't grasping it right away, or maybe have built their model, tried something and it didn't work. Well, then they can adjust like we want them to, but providing that space for them. And maybe, I think they mentioned this in the book, where maybe one manipulative that they were using wasn't working for them, so then they switched to something else. So providing that space for them to use all types of different modes in order to solve the problem, because that's what we do as adults. If we can't figure out something one way, like we're pulling from all of our different resources, and we can't just use one resource for one area of our life. Like we're going to pull from what we know and what's comfortable for us. So that's just
right.
My spiel.
Yes, absolutely. So hopefully that answered Kate's question. I want to, before we get into the FAQs at the back, because I had a couple additional thoughts to add to the FAQs, I want to add this question. Hopefully you can see it on the screen. So, okay, it's the second part of this. Did anyone else think about, should we create an anchor chart with each different problem type? type of problem would help, or do a word problem a day and have students recognize what aspect is missing, start unknown or change unknown. So my thoughts here, one, it would not be my recommendation to do an anchor chart with each problem type, like to name the problems. And I think they even said that kind of in the first one. Like, I don't necessarily care that a student can identify it and say, oh, it is this type of problem and like this is the unknown or anything like that. Like, to me, it is more understanding, like, if we're talking about division, for example, understanding that, oh, this is a division problem and like this is the action that's happening here, and like, or I recognize that this is a division problem because I recognize this action that's happening, or I recognize this relationship. Like, that to me is the goal, for it to be more like, I just don't want this to be proceduralized. I think that's my hesitation with creating like an anchor chart and naming them and all of that. I do think that there's value in creating an anchor chart. Like, if you're working on two different division problems and you create an anchor chart and it's like, okay, how are these problems similar? How are they different? Like, do we see this again, like in a different type of problem or a different type of situation? I think that's different. But like if we're talking about like some type of chart that looks like, trying to find it, that looks like similar to this, like, I personally would not do that. So I don't know. What do you think, Geraldine?
I completely agree. I think it's I can understand where this person's coming from, because it's really good to have like that tangible anchor to have.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
but then also, like, it doesn't allow for kids to have space to be messy there, which is what we want to happen. And so I think like putting something up that's tangible is kind of like, oh, well, mine doesn't look like that, so mine's wrong.
Yeah, I could totally see that. Yeah. It's a balance between like, this is personally why I love my math journals, like, synthesizing that learning at the end, but like, I want them to have the space to do it on their own, for it to be messy. And then at the end, it's like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Ultimately, the goal is we want these problem types to be just like intuitive for them, or like so ingrained in them that they just like see it. And I don't know that if we like make it into like a nice set, poster, or it's just very clean, like, I think that can actually like hinder our work towards getting it to be like ingrained in them. So, okay, let's see. One more thing before we jump into these Q&As. Somebody said, my kids coming up think cubes is the only problem solving strategy. I need to teach them strategies at the beginning of the year. Yes, there are so many. I mean, that's again why we talked about this at our planning session yesterday. It's like, there's so much undoing that we almost have to do in those first couple weeks of school, and show them, like, kind of replace it with different ideas, like almost like break the foundation to rebuild it. So
When I was reading that comment, I just had like a thought where a lot of times we're always saying like problem solving strategy. So it feels like the strategy needs to have things that I'm checking off of a list. I mean, that's just how I work, because I'm very like type A. Like, I need to see things, I need to have it organized. But I wonder if we start kind of shifting what we're saying, and we're looking at like a problem solving approach, because I feel like approach is
oh, that's
the way
good.
that I'm saying, when I say that, it makes me feel like I have any kind of entry point. I can come into this from any angle, and I can begin to work there, rather than having like a strategy, because I may not have a strategy. I may not know where to begin, but I can always like walk up to that problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. That totally makes sense. And I love that word approach. I keep going back to, I did a training like months ago. It was talking about, actually in my months ago, it was probably like a year ago, but it was talking about like communities, and it was talking about like communities in all different places. And like, or in all different spaces. And like the, center point of the community is like, people like us do things like this. And it's just like a way of being. And I think about that in the classroom, like, mathematicians like us do this. And I think like when we ingrain that this is like how we approach problems, like, mathematicians like us in this classroom, like, this is like our community right here. This is how we do things. We get messy. Like, we dive into problems, we try things, like, we're collaborating, we're talking to each other. Like, I just think you can totally like break down that previous foundation and build this new one with like kind of having it almost be like this is just how we do things here. This is our approach. I don't know. To me, that's like very different than like, okay, this is our checklist. This is what we follow. And so, yeah, I
Because I
think,
think it just provides a space to, like, mess up, and I think especially with kids now, is they may not feel, um, comfortable enough to make those mistakes, and so when
mhm.
they mess up, it's just like, "Oh," and then they kind of, like, sink back in, whereas if they have that space already provided for them, like, "You're gonna make a mistake, and that's fine, but, like, that's what we all do here, and we're all approaching this together."
Yeah, absolutely. I just, I was not laughing at you, by the way.
I know, I saw
So,
it too.
Chelsea said, it's two of my favorite math people. It's Chelsea, so you don't have to call me Facebook user. Okay, thank you for giving us a laugh tonight, Chelsea. Okay,
You're the
so
best.
let's dive in. Let's finish up. So we've got a couple Q&As. Like the first part, I thought it was great that they just went ahead and addressed like students do not have to memorize these problem types. Um, we've already kind of talked about the fact that we need to be intentional to choose problems, just to give students exposure to all different types of problems. Okay, this last one is one that I'm very passionate about. It says, I've not used concrete representations very much. How do I start? What should I look out for? And they even said this in the book, but like I think starting with manipulatives, like you have to do your own learning first. Like if you do not understand how to use a certain manipulative to represent a concept, like you aren't going to be able to support students in exploring that as well. So I would say if you've never started with math manipulatives, do some learning on it, and explore the math yourself. Like, how would you do it with whatever tools you have? Um, so, yeah, what would you say to a teacher who is never used manipulatives a day in their life and they just want to get started?
Oh my goodness. I mean, same thing, like, I would just say just dive into it, like, pick some of the problems that you would give your students and go for it, you know? There's just like we're encouraging students that there's no right or wrong way to approach this it's the same thing for teachers, you know, there's no right or wrong way to approach it in your own way. I mean, obviously there's a right or wrong answer, but like your approach can look very unique. And I think where I get my best learning, because I'm not gonna lie, there was a time where I had no idea how to use base 10 blocks because it was so foreign to me. But like I just exposed my kids to it. And as my kids started making sense of it, I was able to make sense of it through their like through their mistakes a lot of times, through how they were explaining stuff, through the problems that they were doing. So I mean, I'm not gonna lie, honestly, if just give it to the kids and listen to what they're saying. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I would just sit at my small group table and give kids problems and give them manipulatives and be like, okay, you figure it out. And I learned so much in those moments just by hearing them talk and finding, oh, this student used this way to solve it where I wouldn't have done that. I would have never thought about that, but then that helps me teach another group later on. So really just exposing yourself on your own, but then also just letting your kids dive into it and see where they are because they may have a different experience than you do.
That's true. I think it's like, it's like that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's like if students have experience from previous grade levels, like using the manipulatives, then yeah, they're going to have some really good insights. If
Mhm,
students have never used pattern blocks with fractions before a day in their life, and you
mhm.
also don't know how to use pattern blocks with fractions,
Right.
that might be a rough situation.
A little bit.
But yeah, I mean, but I also think too, you're so right. Like it is so valuable to listen to students' thoughts about the tools that they're using as well, because they sometimes make relationships that you may not have seen.
Mhm.
So somebody asked, is it possible to get just fourths and twelfths to add to pattern blocks? If you are just getting started with math manipulatives and you have two math manipulatives that you can purchase and that's it, I would say base 10 blocks and pattern blocks if you teach fourth and fifth grade. Like those two things are like go-tos for me. And so to
Mhm.
get the pattern blocks, you can actually, if you post in the Facebook group, I'll give you the link to this, but there is a set that you can purchase that is just fourths and twelfths, and you can add it to whatever pattern blocks that you already have.
I wish they would just
Um,
start putting them in the set that you can buy. Like,
I
why do I have
know.
to buy them separately?
Oh, I know. It's so frustrating. And you can do so much more with pattern blocks when you have the fourths and twelfths. So,
Oh my gosh, it opens up a whole new world.
yes, it really does. Okay. So, I that's it. Oh my gosh, I feel like we've spent 5 weeks together. That's the end of our book study. It's kind of sad. So, although I'm sure everybody's like, okay, we've thought about math for 5 weeks, like now we need a break. But I know I will get lots of questions about the PD certificate. I'm going to create a post. I would give you the link right now, but I actually can't post in the comments from, oh, maybe I can. I think I can actually post the link in the comments. So let me see if I can copy it from my desktop or my iPad and see if it'll post. Can't post messages to some channels. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, so I think I was able to post it. If you're watching on YouTube, you should see the link to the to get the PD certificate. What it does is it's going to take you, you're going to have to complete a survey. Basically, it allows us to document that like you actually did complete the book study, and then you'll get the PD certificate on the back end. So if you're watching on Facebook, like on the Mix and Math page, you should see it. If you're watching in either of the Facebook groups, you're not going to be able to see the link that I just posted, but I will post it in the group so that way you have it. But thank y'all so much for joining for this book study. It was so much fun. Geraldine, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It was so
Thanks
fun to
for
have you on
asking
like
me.
the last week. Like it
I
was just
know.
was a perfect way to end. So we are always here to support you. Geraldine is in both of our upper elementary math teacher Facebook group and also in the Mix and Math 360 group. Obviously, I'm in both as well. So if you have questions, if you get to a point where you are trying to implement this school year and you have questions, of course, post in the group. If you want to continue learning more kind of like about all of this and you want to be like in a smaller community with teachers who really align with this approach, then Mix and Math 360 is like the next step for you. But regardless, I am so excited to get to see all of this kind of like unfold and play out in the classroom. So y'all better not be strangers. Be sure you post all the time in the group. And I guess I should say bye. I'm just so sad that it's over.
Talk soon.
So yes. All right. Well, hopefully y'all all go and leave and enjoy your favorite summer drink, and we will talk math with you again soon.